The dusty photo album held a truth no one expected. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, as Clara Matthews stood in the doorway of her grandmother's bedroom for the first time since the funeral. October rain drummed against the glass, creating rivulets that caught the pale afternoon light and cast dancing shadows across the hardwood floors. The air still carried the faintest trace of lavender, her grandmother's signature scent that had once made this house feel like the warmest place on earth. Now, silence filled every corner where laughter used to echo. Clara pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, fighting back the wave of grief that threatened to overwhelm her. At 32, she thought she understood loss, but nothing had prepared her for this hollow ache that followed her everywhere since Eleanor Matthews had passed away 3 weeks ago. "I don't know where to start, Grandma," she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible above the rain. The familiar floral wallpaper seemed to listen, patient and understanding, as it had always been during Clara's childhood visits. She remembered racing up these same stairs after school, finding Eleanor in the kitchen with flour on her apron and stories on her lips. Clara's mother, Susan, had offered to help with the sorting, but Clara had insisted on doing it alone. This felt too personal, too sacred to share with anyone else. Eleanor had been more than a grandmother to her. She'd been her anchor during her parents' messy divorce when Clara was 12, her confidant through teenage heartbreaks, and her biggest supporter when Clara decided to become a social worker instead of following the family tradition of law. The house felt impossibly large now, filled with 78 years of memories belonging to a woman who had seemed immortal until the very end. Eleanor had lived in this same house since 1952, when she married Clara's grandfather, William. Every room told a story. The kitchen, where she had taught Clara to make her famous apple pie. The living room, where they had spent countless evenings reading together. The garden, where Eleanor had shown her the difference between weeds and wildflowers. Clara began with the dresser, carefully folding Eleanor's hand-knitted sweaters and placing them in donation boxes. Each item felt heavy with memory. A silk scarf triggered the recollection of Eleanor wearing it to Clara's college graduation. A pair of reading glasses brought back images of her grandmother squinting at crossword puzzles, refusing to admit she needed a stronger prescription. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself moving more slowly, pausing to examine each photograph on the nightstand, each book on the shelf. Eleanor had been a meticulous keeper of memories, saving everything from Clara's childhood drawings to newspaper clippings of local events. It was both beautiful and overwhelming. The bedroom led Clara to contemplate tackling the attic, a space she had rarely visited as a child. Eleanor had always referred to it as the memory keeper, claiming it held things too precious to use but too meaningful to discard. With a deep breath, Clara climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under her weight like a familiar greeting. The attic stretched the length of the house, with slanted ceilings and dormer windows that provided just enough light to reveal the organized chaos within. Boxes labeled in Eleanor's careful handwriting lined the walls. William's army letters, Clara's school papers, holiday decorations, 1960 to 1980. The methodical organization was so typically Eleanor that Clara found herself smiling through her tears. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of Christmas decorations, stood an old wardrobe that Clara didn't remember seeing before. The dark wood was polished despite the dusty surroundings, as if Eleanor had continued to care for it even when it was tucked away from view. Clara approached it with curiosity, running her fingers along the intricate carved details on its doors. Inside, she found Eleanor's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, along with William's dress uniform and a collection of hat boxes filled with gloves, scarves, and costume jewelry. But it was the heavy leather photo album on the bottom shelf that caught her attention. Unlike the other albums Clara had seen throughout the house, this one seemed forgotten, covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been opened in years. Clara carefully lifted the leather album from the wardrobe shelf, feeling its substantial weight in her hands. The burgundy cover was worn smooth in places where hands had once lovingly turned it, and the brass clasps had tarnished to a deep green. She settled onto an old rocking chair near the window, where the grey October light provided enough illumination to see clearly. The first page made her smile immediately. There was Eleanor at 18, radiant in a simple white dress, standing next to William in his crisp army uniform, outside the very church where Clara had attended countless Sunday services as a child. The black and white photograph captured a moment of pure joy. Eleanor's head tilted back in laughter, while William gazed at her with unmistakable adoration. Page by page, Clara traced the familiar story of her grandparents' life together. Their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, where Eleanor wore a polka-dot dress and William looked uncomfortable in civilian clothes. The purchase of this very house, with Eleanor proudly holding the keys while standing in the overgrown front garden. The birth of Clara's mother, Susan, captured in a series of tender photographs showing William cradling his newborn daughter while Eleanor looked on with tired but radiant eyes. These were the images Clara had seen before, the photographs that had decorated Eleanor's living room and filled the family albums downstairs. Each picture reinforced the narrative Clara had always known, a simple, devoted couple who had built a life together based on steady love and mutual respect. Eleanor had often spoken of William with gentle affection, describing him as a good man who worked hard at the post office and never forgot their anniversary. The progression through the album felt like walking through a museum of her family's history. There was Susan taking her first steps in the back garden, Eleanor teaching her to ride a bicycle, family picnics at Salem Willows, where 3 generations would later gather for Clara's own childhood outings. The photographs were windows into a world of Sunday dinners, birthday parties, and quiet moments that had shaped Clara's understanding of what family meant. As Clara turned each page, she found herself narrating the stories Eleanor had told her countless times. This was the summer your mother learned to swim at the beach. She was so afraid of the water at first, but Papa William was so patient with her. Clara could almost hear Eleanor's voice, warm with memory and love, explaining each photograph with the detailed attention of someone who treasured every moment. The middle section of the album documented the growing years. Susan graduating high school, dating Clara's father, their engagement party in Eleanor's back garden. These photos showed Eleanor aging gracefully, her dark hair slowly turning silver, but her smile remaining as warm and welcoming as ever. William appeared less frequently in the later photos, and Clara remembered Eleanor mentioning that he had become camera shy as he got older. Near the end of the album, Clara found her own earliest photographs, a tiny pink bundle in Eleanor's arms at the hospital, her first Christmas surrounded by grandparents who looked absolutely besotted with their granddaughter, her first birthday party in Eleanor's kitchen with a homemade cake shaped like a butterfly. These images felt like coming home, reminding Clara of all the ways Eleanor had been present for every important moment of her life. But as Clara reached what should have been the final pages of the album, she noticed something odd. The last few photographs seemed loosely placed, not mounted with the same care as the earlier images. And there, tucked behind a photo of Clara's high school graduation, was a single picture that didn't belong with the others. The photograph was older than the surrounding images, yellowed at the edges with that particular sepia tone of pictures from the early 1950s. In it, a young woman who was unmistakably Eleanor stood in a garden Clara didn't recognize, her face glowing with a happiness so intense it seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. But Eleanor wasn't alone. She was embracing a man who was definitely not William, a tall, dark-haired stranger whose face was turned toward Eleanor with an expression of such tender devotion that it made Clara's breath catch. And cradled in Eleanor's arms was a baby, its tiny face peaceful in sleep, wrapped in a delicate white blanket that looked hand-knitted with extraordinary care. Clara turned the photograph over with trembling fingers and found a date written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, May 15th, 1951. Her mind immediately began calculating. Eleanor and William had married in September 1951. Susan had been born in December 1952. This photograph had been taken 4 months before Eleanor's wedding and more than a year before Susan was born. The rain outside had intensified, matching the storm of confusion that was building in Clara's chest. Clara stared at the photograph until her eyes watered, willing it to make sense within the framework of everything she thought she knew about her family. The rain had stopped, and the attic had grown dim with approaching evening, but she remained frozen in the rocking chair, holding this impossible image that challenged everything Eleanor had ever told her. She examined every detail with the intensity of a detective. The man in the photograph was handsome in a completely different way than William. Where her grandfather had been solid and dependable looking, this stranger appeared artistic, with gentle eyes and hands that looked like they might belong to a musician or writer. His clothing was well tailored but understated, and the way he looked at Eleanor suggested an intimacy that went far beyond casual friendship. But it was the baby that truly shook Clara to her core. The child was clearly newborn, with that unmistakable fragility of a life just beginning. Eleanor held the infant with the practiced confidence of motherhood, her body language speaking of protective love and fierce devotion. Yet according to every story Clara had ever been told, Eleanor's first child had been Susan, born nearly 2 years after this photograph was taken. Clara's hands shook as she set the photograph aside and examined the rest of the album more carefully. Hidden behind other pictures, she found 2 more images that belonged to the same mysterious chapter of Eleanor's life. One showed Eleanor sitting on a porch swing, visibly pregnant, reading a book while the same dark-haired man worked in a garden in the background. The other captured Eleanor in a hospital bed, holding the same baby from the first photograph, with the mysterious man standing beside her, his hand gently touching the infant's head. Each photograph was dated, creating a timeline that made Clara's heart race. The pregnancy photo was from February 1951, the hospital picture from March 1951, and the garden scene from May 1951. By September of that same year, Eleanor was walking down the aisle to marry William, and by all accounts, she had never mentioned having another life before that moment. Clara carefully removed the photographs from the album and made her way downstairs to Eleanor's kitchen, where better light and a magnifying glass might reveal more details. The familiar room felt different now, as if the walls were keeping secrets. She spread the photographs on the maple table, where she had eaten countless breakfasts during childhood visits, the same table where Eleanor had taught her to knead bread and fold pie crusts. Under the magnifying glass, Clara could see that Eleanor was wearing a simple gold band in all 3 photographs. Not the elaborate wedding set that Clara remembered from her grandmother's hand, but a different ring entirely. And in the background of the garden photograph, she could make out what appeared to be a small house, painted white with blue shutters, completely different from the Victorian home where Eleanor had spent her married life. Clara's training as a social worker had taught her to look for patterns, to piece together stories from fragments of information. But this puzzle felt impossibly personal and painful. Every possible explanation she constructed seemed to contradict the fundamental truths about the woman who had raised her to believe in honesty, commitment, and the sanctity of family bonds. As darkness settled over Salem, Clara found herself pacing through Eleanor's house, searching for any other evidence of this hidden chapter. In Eleanor's bedroom, she looked through jewelry boxes and dresser drawers with new eyes, seeking anything that might connect to the mysterious photographs. In the living room, she examined the books on Eleanor's shelves, wondering if any contained pressed flowers or hidden letters that might explain everything. It was in Eleanor's writing desk that Clara finally found the next piece of the puzzle. Tucked in the back of a drawer filled with household receipts and correspondence was a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return address read Michael Chen, Sunset Beach, California, and the postmark dates ranged from 1951 to 1953. Clara's heart pounded as she untied the ribbon with careful fingers. The first letter was written in a masculine hand that was both elegant and hurried, as if the writer had been eager to communicate but pressed for time. It was dated March 20th, 1951, just days after the hospital photograph. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "I cannot stop thinking about our beautiful son and the impossible choice we have made. Thomas grows stronger each day, and when I look at him, I see your eyes and your gentle spirit. I know we agreed this was best for all of us, but my heart breaks every morning when I wake up and remember that you are both so far away." Clara had to stop reading and sit down heavily in Eleanor's desk chair. Thomas. The baby had a name, and he was Eleanor's son, Clara's uncle, a person who had never existed in any family story she had ever heard. She forced herself to continue reading, even as her understanding of Eleanor's life continued to crumble. "The adoption papers are progressing, as we discussed," Michael's letter continued. "The family in Oregon seems wonderful, and they have promised to send updates about Thomas's growth and education. I hope someday he will understand that we gave him away not because we loved him less, but because we loved him too much to trap him in a world that would judge him for the circumstances of his birth." Clara spent the entire night reading Michael's letters, each one revealing more of Eleanor's secret history. By dawn, she understood the truth that her grandmother had carried alone for more than 60 years. Eleanor had loved Michael Chen with a passion that consumed her, but their relationship had existed in 1951, when interracial love was not just discouraged, but dangerous in many parts of America, including conservative Salem. The letters painted a picture of two young people who had met at a summer music program in Boston, where Eleanor was studying piano and Michael was working toward becoming a composer. Their love affair had been brief but intense, resulting in Eleanor's pregnancy at a time when unwed mothers faced social ostracism and mixed-race children were often rejected by both communities. Michael's final letter, dated December 1953, was different from the others. His handwriting was more composed, resigned. "My darling Eleanor, I received your wedding photograph, and I want you to know that seeing your smile brought me more peace than sorrow. William seems like a good man who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I hope your new life brings you the happiness and security that our love could never provide. I will stop writing now, as we agreed, but know that a part of my heart will always belong to you and to Thomas, wherever he may be." Clara sat in Eleanor's kitchen as the sun rose over Salem, surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's secret life. The photographs, the letters, and her own memories began to form a new narrative about the woman she thought she knew completely. Eleanor hadn't been just the devoted wife and mother Clara had imagined. She had been young and passionate, and brave enough to love someone society told her she shouldn't love. She had carried a child in secret and made the agonizing decision to give him up for adoption, to protect him from a world that wouldn't accept him. And then Eleanor had married William, had Susan, and had built the life that Clara had always seen as the complete story. But now Clara understood it was only the second chapter of a much more complex tale. The realization that she had an uncle somewhere in the world, a man named Thomas, who would now be in his 70s, filled Clara with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Eleanor had kept this secret for her entire married life, never telling even Susan about the brother she had never known existed. Clara found herself wondering about the weight of such a secret. How had Eleanor managed to smile at family gatherings while carrying the knowledge of a lost child? How had she celebrated Mother's Day and Susan's milestones while grieving for the son she had given away? The strength required to maintain that silence seemed almost superhuman. As the morning progressed, Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would find Thomas. Eleanor's secret had died with her, but Clara could honor her grandmother's hidden love by locating the child she had sacrificed so much to protect. The letters mentioned an adoption agency in Portland, Oregon, and with her social work background, Clara knew she had the resources to trace his whereabouts. 3 weeks later, Clara stood outside a small craftsman-style house in Portland's Hawthorne district, holding a folder containing copies of Eleanor's photographs and Michael's letters. Her hands trembled as she approached the front door, knowing that the next few minutes would change 2 lives forever. The man who answered the door was clearly Eleanor's son. At 73, Thomas Chen Rodriguez had Eleanor's gentle eyes and Michael's artistic hands, which were stained with what appeared to be pottery clay. When Clara introduced herself and explained why she had come, his face cycled through disbelief, wonder, and finally overwhelming emotion. "I always knew I was adopted," he told her, as they sat in his studio, surrounded by beautiful ceramic sculptures. "But I never imagined I had a family who remembered me." Clara spent 3 days with Thomas, sharing Eleanor's photographs and stories, learning about his life as a successful artist and father of 4 grown children. He showed her pictures of his adoptive parents, who had loved him dearly and raised him with pride in both his Chinese and European heritage. He had searched for his birth parents in his 40s, but had been told the records were sealed and his birth mother had requested no contact. "She was protecting you," Clara explained, showing him Michael's letters. "The world was different then. She loved you enough to give you a life free from the prejudice you would have faced." On Clara's final day in Portland, Thomas gave her a small ceramic bowl he had made, its glaze the exact shade of blue as Eleanor's favorite dress. "Will you take this to her grave?" he asked. "I want her to know that her sacrifice wasn't wasted. I had a wonderful life, and I forgive her for the choice she made." Back in Salem, Clara knelt beside Eleanor's headstone in the old cemetery behind the church, where her grandmother had married William. She placed Thomas's bowl among the fallen autumn leaves and spoke aloud for the first time since beginning this journey. "I understand now, Grandma. You weren't just the woman who taught me to bake and told me bedtime stories. You were brave and complicated and human in ways I never imagined. You loved Thomas enough to let him go, and you loved our family enough to build something beautiful from your second chance. I hope you can rest knowing that your son grew up happy and whole, and that your secret was kept until it was safe to tell." The dusty photo album had indeed held a truth no one expected. But in discovering Eleanor's hidden love and heartbreak, Clara had found something even more precious. A deeper understanding of the complexity of human love and the different ways people sacrifice for those they cherish. Eleanor's legacy was not diminished by her secret, it was made more profound by the revelation that she had been capable of both passionate love and selfless sacrifice, sometimes simultaneously. As Clara walked home through the streets of Salem, she carried with her a new appreciation for the stories hidden behind every ordinary face, and a profound respect for the grandmother who had taught her that the truest love sometimes requires the courage to remain silent.